Okay. This is our 21st lesson on biblical hermeneutics, and we're continuing on the a fortiori principle, making several more applications of the principle. And we're going to apply transposition to it. Now, transposition is when we reverse the antecedent and the consequent in a conditional statement and negate both of them. Remember, a double negation becomes an affirmative, just like it does in mathematics. Let's explain transposition to the problem of understanding the scriptures. Here, we're going to apply this. If something is not true of our Lord, who is greater than us, then it is not true for us. So that's a good illustration of this principle. So whatever is not true of the greater is not true of the lesser. The a fortiori principle in its first form says what's true of the lesser is true of the greater. Now then, the negative of that would be what's not true of the greater is not true of the lesser. And of course, in the logic class, I demonstrated that both these forms are found in the New Testament. We're going to apply this to the church and also to individual Christians as well as we apply it. By logical formulas, we're going to explain it by logical formulas, and we'll use a valid conditional syllogism. If A, then B. True, therefore B is true. Now, the letter A represents what's called the antecedent, and the letter B represents the consequent. So we affirm the antecedent to be true, and if we establish this second premise, A is true, and if the relationship between A and B is correct according to our statement on the first premise, then the conclusion is a necessary inference. It follows. And so we're saying that B is a necessary term for A to be true. Okay? If A is true, then B has to be true. That's what we're saying if B is necessary. And we're saying if B is true, and if A is true, it's sufficient to then say B is true. B is necessary that B be true. Okay. All right. Now that's our conclusion of our statement. This argument in the prior slide can be changed by transposition. The antecedent A exchanges places with consequent B, and both are negated. That's the rule. That's transposition. And we showed in the logic class that, in fact, this is accomplished and done in the scriptures. So this logical principle is a scriptural principle that where it was applied to a fact or some points in the scriptures. A double negative, a double negation becomes a positive. This times minus in mathematics becomes positive. And minus and plus in mathematics is just direction. I'm not a mathematician. I've had about 55 semester hours of mathematics in college, but I've never seen a mathematics course where a negative and plus sign meant anything but direction. There may be, and I'm not saying that it doesn't, but all the math I've taken, it's meant direction. By the logical process of transposition, the valid syllogism above becomes, if not B, then not A. Not B, therefore not A. So we have two basic forms of this a fortiori principle. If A is true of the lesser, then it's true of the greater. A is true of the lesser. Let's go back to our form. True of the lesser, then it's true of the greater. A is true of the lesser, therefore A is true of the greater. Okay, that's the first form. Second form is our form here. If B is not true for the greater, then it is not true for the lesser. All and it's not true for the greater, therefore it's not true for the lesser. That's our basic. So we reverse the antecedent and consequent, A and B. We negate both of them. And they exchange places, and the form then is the same. In other words, the statement is still true. It always is. If the first conditional syllogism was sound, the second will be automatically sound. Jesus used this principle in John 5:45 to 47. We're going to show this. We've already shown this in the logic class. Think not that I come to accuse you to the Father. There is one that accuses you, even Moses, of whom you have set your hope. For if you believe Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. But if you believe not his writings, how shall you believe my words? So the form of it is an a fortiori argument. The Lord's argument is, if you believe Moses, then you believe me. You do not believe my words, then you do not believe Moses. That's transposition. Since Jesus used this hermeneutical principle, so you didn't believe my words, therefore you didn't believe Moses. Since he used this principle, we may use it. And in fact, are expected to use it. The Lord used it, and he is a pattern for us, according to 1 Peter chapter 2. So here we see the negation of it, that Jesus negated and reversed the antecedent and consequent. He actually used transposition right here. Jesus himself did it. Any questions? A then B is transposed to become, if not B, then not A. The a fortiori principle simply stated is whatsoever is not true of the greater is not true of the lesser. That's the second form of it. The first form is what is true of the lesser is true of the greater. So now we have two hermeneutical principles. Both are from the a fortiori principle. Two forms of it. One's negative and one's positive. One takes from the lesser to the greater, and the other one takes the greater. What is not true of the greater is not true of the lesser. Are there questions? Now, we should employ this process in biblical interpretation whenever these conditions are correct for applying it. So this is important that we do that too, make sure we have correctly applied. If our Lord, who is greater than us, could not escape the responsibility of serving, then we do not escape the responsibility of serving. I believe this is a principle that we have to follow. In this passage, if I then, the Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, ye also ought to wash one another's feet. And he goes on and says how he's greater than them. So if you look in this context, Jesus is actually using the a fortiori principle. I have not escaped the responsibility of serving, and I became a servant. For I have given you an example that you also should do as I have done to you. Verily, verily, I say unto you, a servant is not greater than his Lord, neither one that has sent greater than he that sent him. One that is sent is an apostle, see. The word apostle means one sent. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. So since I've given you a pattern, you should follow my example. I have not felt myself too great to serve. I have washed feet. And so you should be willing to do that as well yourself. This is teaching the necessity of serving. Teaching the necessity of humility. If I, who am greater, humbled myself to do this, then you should be willing to humble yourself and do whatever you need. Any questions or comments? In this passage. If the Lord did not escape persecution, John 15:20, we'll look at that in just a minute, then they will not escape persecution. Again, he uses argument, this basic principle in this passage of scripture. Remember the word that I said unto you, his servant is not greater than his Lord. So the Lord's greater than the servant. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. So if they persecuted me, they'll persecute you. You're not going to escape persecution. I have been persecuted, and they're going to persecute you. If they kept my word, they will keep yours also. So they have, and so Jesus is arguing. Now, this has to be framed in a negative form. So here is, if I have not escaped persecution, if I, who am greater than you, have not escaped persecution, then you will not escape persecution, a fortiori. If they have not disobeyed my word, then they will not disobey your word. To put it in a negative form, and that would fit the a fortiori principle. So keeping the word is not disobeying his word. They've kept his word. You frame it in a fortiori argument form. All who have the will or intent to live godly, Paul used, will be persecuted. Okay, and all that would live godly in Christ Jesus suffer persecution. So we're going to suffer persecution, all those who desire to live godly. Now, our persecution may be different and not as strong and not as rigid and rigorous as Jesus' persecution, like crucifixion. I hope none of us endure that. But that's the case. We sometimes are persecuted. We may not even recognize it. We may not get an advancement at work. We will certainly be ostracized by some people. Even if we preach and teach the truth in love, the world will persecute us in a number of ways, and they do. They do persecute us if we're faithful to the Lord. So this is the application of that principle that Jesus laid out. If God is greater than man, and man must always do good, he cannot do evil in order that good would come. So we frame it in a negative form. If man must always do good, then God must always do good. And so if man cannot do evil in order to bring good about, then God cannot do evil that good would come about. So God won't ever do evil that good would come about. And why not? As we are slanderously reported. Now, slander is a false accusation. So this is actually saying, because it's slander, that those that affirm that we say that us do evil that good may come, its condemnation is just. So this is a slander. So we do not teach that we should do evil that good would come. That's what Paul is saying. It's a slander to say that we teach that. So this is negative. So here, if God is greater than man, man must always do good. In order that good would come, then man must always do good. God must always do good. All right? So that us do evil that good would come, may come, that's a slander, of course. So we can't teach that because God cannot do that. God will not do evil that good would come. God does not bring on such things as the death of people in automobile accidents or wars. And what we run into here. The attributing of evil acts to the providence of God is wrong. Someone says it was the providence of God that someone died in an auto accident. And they can't prove that. God does that. Now, God has killed certain people because of their wickedness. But that's a different matter. Those who advocate theological determinism, Calvinists, Muslims, etc., have God causing every evil thing to occur. Theological determinism says that everything happens because God controls everything. He's in control of everything, and he makes everything happen that does happen. Of course, that's not true. Okay? Wars are brought on by the lust of men, James 4:1. James tells us, whence come wars, where they come from, and whence come fightings among you. Where do fightings come from? Come they not hence, even of your pleasures, at war in your members? And he goes on and gives more information about it. People lust and they try to have what someone else possesses. I suspect in what limited knowledge I have, that when Russia attacked Ukraine last year, I suspect that was all because they wanted their land, wanted to control them. God allows men free will, and man's lust causes him to sin and possibly harm others by means of this sin. So it's a choice of someone, an evil choice of someone else, that frequently brings on wars. What about 1 Corinthians 14, 34 through 36? This passage, I believe, will help us as we go through it. Notice the passage. This supposedly means that this passage doesn't apply today. Why? Well, they say, but this is only for the age of miracles. This is a doctrine that's taught by some in the church. And they argue that this was limited to the wives of prophets. Since we don't have any prophets today, this doesn't apply to us. We're going to apply the a fortiori principle to this argument, assuming, just for the sake of argument, and I don't agree with it, but assuming that's true, that this is only for the wives of the prophets. So make an assumption that it is, and see what's implied even by that false assumption. So we're going to make this application. If the wives of the prophets were to remain silent, 1 Corinthians 14, 34 through 35, and the remaining silent is to be a speaker, we have to get into the meaning of the passage in present tense infinitive in the context of 1 Corinthians 14. Then other wives will remain silent, not to speak. So if they were not to speak, if the wives of the prophets are not to speak, then the wives of other wives were not to speak as well. I want to give you my argument for it and how this works. Let's look at the passage that the women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted them to speak. Now, to speak there is a present infinitive, to be a speaker. But let them be in subjection, as also saith the law. And if they would learn anything, let them ask their own husbands. Now, the word husbands here probably refers to men of the household where they lived. Women just did not go off and live by themselves at that time. For it is shameful for a woman to speak, to be a speaker in the church. Now, women speak when they make the good confession. They speak when they sing. So it's not condemning that action. It's to be a speaker because of the present. The office of a prophet, let's lay out here now. Let's assume this is the wives of the prophets that we're speaking about here. And that's the claim that's made by some. If the office of a prophet is greater than any office in the church today, I'm going to prove that it is in 1 Corinthians 12, 28. If it's true that the greater, the wife of a prophet, was not to speak, then it's true that the lesser, the wife of a non-prophet, is not to speak. So if we prove that a prophet is the greatest office in the church, other than the office of an apostle, then we lay our passage clear, and it's clear here that the wife of the non-prophet is not permitted to speak either. Therefore, this has application to the church today. Right. Now, some claim this is referring to the wives of the prophets mentioned in verse 32. Even if this were true, this does not change the principle, as evidenced by this argument. 1 Corinthians 14, 31, 32, for ye can all prophesy one by one, that all may learn and all may be exhorted. And the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. So right here now we have in this passage, that's where they get this, and they say this is the wives of the prophets. But let's back up a bit to the passage that I noted a moment ago. We'll go back to it. We're going to read it, 1 Corinthians 12, 28. And God has set some in the church, first apostles, secondly prophets, thirdly teachers. Now, this is the offices set in the church. In the Greek language, the order of words is a matter of emphasis. And so the first one listed will be the most prominent. Let me illustrate this with the listing of the apostles. When the apostles are listed in the Gospels, well, I would say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the fourfold gospel, that's what I would call it. In the fourfold gospel books, the 4 books, when the listing is, the last one listed is always Judas Iscariot. And the first one could be someone else, but it's not ever Judas Iscariot. The order of the listing of the apostles is by their prominence. And so when you read the order of the listing, the catalog of them, the order, Judas is always last. Okay. All right, Judas Iscariot. Now, there are 2 Judases now, but we're talking about Judas Iscariot. The office of the prophet is greater than any other office, and it is greater than any other office other than apostleship, according to verse 28 of 1 Corinthians 12, as he lists all of these offices. Now, what we find then is if they're only second to the apostles in the listing of the order of the gifts, the importance of the gifts, and a wife of a prophet would be the wife of one who's the second greatest office in the church. And there are only 13 apostles, if you count Judas Iscariot to be 14. So we'd have Matthias took Judas's place, and then we have the Apostle Paul later. So it'll be 14 if we leave off Judas because he didn't serve as an apostle after the cross because he committed suicide. And so now he betrayed the Lord, of course. But what we run into then is, one would say, well, but this wouldn't apply to the apostles' wives, but it would, because all the apostles are also prophets. And we get this from some other arguments from Ephesians chapter 2. But we won't have time to go into that because of the limitations of time in this study tonight. Right. Now, let's look carefully here at this verse 31. For you can all prophesy one by one. So he's talking about the prophets. So let's assume that he is talking about the prophets here. If this, then we can say, if the wives of the prophets who are greater are not to speak, then the wives of the non-prophets who are lesser are not to speak. Right? Any questions? Now let me explain here my point right here about the apostles, and some would argue this wouldn't apply to them. In Ephesians 2, verse 20 through 21, being built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets. And notice, I want you to read, I'm looking at the American Standard Version. There's not a comma after the word apostles, telling us that they intend that the apostles and prophets be the same group. If there were the different group, there'd be a comma after apostles. And there's a principle in Greek syntax, a Granville-Sharp rule, that would show that the apostles are prophets, according to this passage, according to the structure in the Greek. The word apostles has the article, the word prophets does not. They're both separated by the word and, kai, and that makes them equal. And so the apostles were prophets. They functioned in all the offices, just about all of them. Some of them were even elders, according to Ephesians chapter 5. I'm sorry, according to 1 Peter chapter 5. Okay. Right? So we can all prophesy one by one. If the church here, if the wives of the prophets are not allowed to speak, then the wives of non-prophets are not allowed to speak. So even if we prove this is for prophets, it still applies to us today from the a fortiori principle. Any question? The next one now. If the church should observe holy days, should not observe holy days from the Old Testament. God ordained holy days, and the church should not observe man-made holy days. The church was not to observe God ordained holy days from the Old Testament. And so there were holy days that were ordained by God under the law of Moses. So we get this from Colossians 2:16 and 17, and Galatians 4:8 through 11. The church was not to observe God ordained holy days from the Old Testament, these passages. Therefore, it's not to observe man-made holy days, which are lesser. So the greater would be God-ordained holy days, the lesser would be man-ordained holy days. Now let's look at Colossians 2:16 and 17. That no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of feast day or new moon or a Sabbath day, which are a shadow of the things to come, but the body is Christ. Now this is referring back the meat, the drink, the feast day, and the new moon, the Sabbath day were all part of the law of Moses. And we know he's talking about, that's what he's talking about in the context, because he says it's a shadow of the things to come. Pagan days were not shadows of the things to come. They were not set forth to represent what's going to come later. They're pagan things, and most of them were linked with idolatry. So it wouldn't be a shadow. Any questions? So that's limited to Christ or to the New Testament and the Christian system. Those days were linked with the law of Moses. And so we find under Christianity, under the New Testament, we don't observe them. In Galatians 4:8 and following, howbeit at that time, not knowing God, you were in bondage to them that by nature are no gods. He's talking to Gentile Christians, Gentiles who obeyed the gospel. He's talking about what they were before they became Christians. But now that ye have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, I turn you back again to the weak and beggarly rudiments, wherein you desire to be in bondage over again. I'm convinced that the ones he's talking to in this context are Gentile Christians who had become Jewish proselytes before they obeyed the gospel. And this will fit the whole both passages. And so you were in bondage to them that were nature no God. That's before you became a Jewish proselyte. But now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, I turn you back again to the weak and beggarly rudiments. And so they're turning back to Judaism. So these people had been pagans, they became Jewish proselytes, and then they became Christians. And some of them were being turned back to Judaism, the weak and beggarly rudiments. And they'd be going back into bondage again. Right? And even Judaism, serving under the law of Moses, was a form of bondage. Okay? All right. Now, he goes on and says, you observe days and months and seasons and years. I'm afraid of you, lest it means I have bestowed labor upon you in vain. So they were observing these days and months and years. Now, if they were observing pagan days, he probably would have said it. So this obviously is going back to the law of Moses. The church should not observe feast days, Passover, Pentecost, new moon, Sabbath days, etc. You don't need to be observing that. Now, we do, in a sense, observe one day, and that's the first day of the week, reserved specifically for 2 acts of worship. There's 2 acts of worship that are to be done on those days, and I believe we can see the Lord's Supper is only for the first day of the week. I believe the contribution was for every first day of the week as well. Correct translation of 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. Each one of you lay by and store on every first day of the week. But these Sabbath days and new moons and so forth were linked in with the law of Moses. Us cannot scripturally observe holy days. If the scriptures have not sanctified a day as holy for the church, then man cannot sanctify days as holy for the church. And then, of course, we can say sanctified Easter, Christmas, etc., is holy for the church. Consequently, Easter, Christmas, Lent, etc., are not holy for the church. Questions? Well, may an individual family observe Easter, Christmas, etc.? That's a different question. If the head of the family deems it useful for the family, they probably could, and I think get this from Romans 14, 5 and 6. So we could set aside, and a family, the head of the family could say, we're going to rest on Saturday. We're not going to work. And he could do that, set it aside and use it as a day for that purpose. But he wouldn't be right to make it binding even upon his children unless it was by virtue of his parental authority. But he sure couldn't bind it on other people outside his family. One man esteemeth one day above another, another esteemeth every day alike, that each man be fully assured in his own mind. So they were esteeming some days better than others. He that regardeth the day regardeth unto the Lord, and he that eateth unto the Lord, for one giveth God thanks, and he that eateth not unto God, he giveth not and giveth God thanks. So again, some individual actions can be done, and an individual can do it, but the church has no business engaging in this stuff. Right? We may neither bind it upon other families, nor bind it upon the church, that no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink in respect of a feast day or a new moon or a Sabbath day, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body is Christ. I don't think there's anything wrong with a family saying on the Passover, we're going to, as a family, we're going to study what's involved. We're going to take that day and we're going to study about the Passover. Or on Pentecost, we're going to study about Pentecost. But observing it gets into a little bit of going back to the law. If we're not careful, we can get involved in that as well. So Pentecost with my family on Pentecost. I may even preach a sermon about what happened at that time. But I don't have the church has no business observing it as a collection, as a collective group. We need to be careful that our liberty does not become a stumbling block to those outside the church. And I believe if we got to observing as individuals these things, we can become a stumbling block. We need to be very careful. We must never confuse individual liberty with something that's binding upon the collective, upon the church. Individuals can do a number of things that the church can't do. God has ordained 4 institutions, and some of my brethren say there's only 3, but I believe there are 4. The home, the civil government, the church, and the employer-employee roles. Each has its own realm or domain. We may observe special days if our purpose is to glorify God. I go to Romans 15, 5 and 6. One man esteemeth one day above another, another esteemeth every day alike. Each man be fully assured in his own mind. He that regardeth the day regardeth unto the Lord, and he that eateth, eateth unto the Lord. For he giveth God thanks, and he eateth not unto the Lord, he eateth not and giveth God thanks. I think this may be Romans 14. I may have that wrong. I think it's Romans 14, 5 and 6. Matthew 23, let's look at this. Sanctification is something that's done by the greater. So let's look here. Woe to you, you blind guides, that say, whosoever shall swear by the temple, it is nothing. Whosoever shall swear by the gold of the temple, he is debtor. Ye fools and blind, for which is greater the gold of the temple that hath sanctified the gold? So the greater sanctifies the lesser. And so if something is sanctified by something, then the sanctifying is greater than what is sanctified. And so you swear by the gold of the temple, he is debtor. But if you swear by the temple, you're not debtor. You don't have to keep your word. And Jesus is arguing, well, the temple is greater than the gold because it sanctified the gold. So he's telling them their claims here and the ways of sneaky ways to get around keeping their word and not having to keep an oath was all of that is just foolishness. You fools and blind, for which is greater the gold of the temple that is sanctified to gold. Well, obviously, what sanctifies something else is greater. That's the Lord's argument. So now we've got the principles. If one thing sanctifies another, whatever did the sanctifying is greater. And so he says, you swear by you say, whosoever shall swear by the altar is nothing. That's what you say. But whosoever shall swear by the gift that's on it, he is debtor. So if I swear by the altar, I don't have to keep my word. But if I swear by the gift on the altar, I have to keep my word. That's just foolishness. And so he says, you blind, which is greater the gift of the altar sanctified the gift. So the altar sanctified the gift, so it's greater. So it becomes greater. And lay this out. We've got one more week. We're going to look at all four theory arguments. The logical process of transposition can be applied to the a fortiori principle. From an application transposition, a fortiori principle, we learned that whatsoever is not true of the greater is not true of the lesser. If our Lord, who's greater than us, could not escape the responsibility of serving, then we cannot escape the responsibility of serving ourselves. Right? Use this illustration. If the Lord did not escape persecution, then they will not escape persecution. The disciples he's talking to, I believe, secondarily, if they who are greater than us, the apostles are greater than us, if they didn't escape persecution, it applied to us too. So these principles would apply to us. Sometimes something is said to the apostles, and the a fortiori principle can make it applicable to us as well. Greater than man, and man must always do good. Now, we cannot do evil. In order to do good, good would come. And God must always do good. He cannot do evil, then good would come. So if God cannot do evil, good would come. The man must not do evil, then good would come as well. If the wives of the prophets would remain silent, then otherwise, those of the lesser offices in the church or lesser roles in the church, then the other wives would remain silent, not speak. And we prove from General Sharp rule from Ephesians 2 that all of the apostles were prophets. Okay? If the church should not observe holy days from the Old Testament, God ordained holy days, and the church should not observe man-made holy days. Which is greater, God-ordained holy days or man-made? Well, God-ordained holy days are greater than man-ordained holy days. Again, this is our basic reasoning from our fortiori arguments. We'll have one more week of this. Are there questions or comments? Anyone?
Would you go back and was somebody else speaking?
No, go ahead.
Oh, if the church should not observe holy days from the Old Testament, then the church should not observe holy days today.
Oh, man-made
correct?
days.
Man-made.
The first day is holy, but I'm talking about man-made holy days.
Okay. That's man-made holy days for their own family. Does the domain make a difference? For the church, for the family?
I think there's a collective responsibility for the church, and then there's these individual responsibilities. They're in different realms. Yeah.
Okay. Then the different realm, if you talked about the father of a family, the head of the family could at one point say, we're going to study the Passover today. That talks about esteeming one day above another, that one man regards one day above another. The father of the household would have the ability to esteem one day above another. What about the aspect of the father being able to, of a household, being able to designate a day of, let's say, we're going to celebrate the birth of Christ and going to do it on Thursday. It's going to be, and then let's take it another step. That's scenario one. We're going to celebrate the birth of Christ. We're going to do it on Friday. And for us, it will be a holy day. You see a distinction there, and are both valid.
Well, I think he probably would have the right to do that. He could set it aside for the family to do that. I think he could. I think the problem, what I've laid out here, is we need to be very careful. Doing that kind of thing can become a stumbling block to other people. Right?
Well, no, if nobody else knows, I don't
Yeah.
go around and advertise.
Yeah.
The other thing I would ask is, even though they're different domains, is the church greater than the individual?
They have different responsibilities. I don't know that the church, the collective, we could say a collective group of members of God's people are greater than an individual. We could argue that, but I don't think that most of the actions that we have is there are individual responsibilities. An individual can do things the church cannot do. I don't believe a church has a duty to entertain my kids. I think, in fact, the money that's given in the treasury, I believe, becomes holy, and it can't be used for that without sinning. But I can use my own money to entertain my kids. Okay, does that make sense? And so we got different realms of authority and responsibility. So the church can do things as a collective that the family can't do, but individuals can do things the church can't do. Okay?
I would agree with that. I'm still trying to sort out in my mind and how the distinction for greater is made, I guess, would be a way to put it.
Well, you could argue in a sense that the collective group of body of Christians, the church, is greater, the whole is greater than the part. Yes. So what we could argue, we get into two other logical problems, which we get into under logical fallacies. Let me illustrate this. We can argue that what's true of the whole is true of individual parts. That's not true. The whole of sodium chloride, table salt, is that it's safe to eat it. But if you take the individual parts, sodium and chloride, chlorine, both of those are poison. Okay, you take
Right.
them. So we can't argue what's true of the whole is true of individual parts. It's not true. We can't argue that what's true of the individual parts is necessarily true of the whole. We have to be careful with that. So there's a logical fallacy involved in that. Fallacy of composition is one of the, right?
So each domain would seem to be distinct and have its own set of rules, in a manner of speaking.
Yes, although all domains are under God's law. Okay.
Right.
Now, a father cannot lie to his children, shouldn't be lying to them. And so in the church, the preacher shouldn't, and elders and individual members shouldn't be lying to one another either. And the civil government shouldn't be lying to people. Okay. And an employee shouldn't be lying to one another. Okay?
Yeah, the basic premise is true, that they all need to conduct themselves in an appropriate manner, regardless of the group.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I thank you for your input.
I hope it's been helpful.
Yes, sir.
All right. I'm going to stop recording now. Well, I just went out of it.